So as you can see, my presentation is not so much focusing on the question whether the EU is still neoliberal or not, but on the question of the effect of neoliberalism, very much driven also by the European Union, on political outcomes and on the rise of illiberalism at the EU's eastern periphery in the what is called the Visegrad countries in East Central Europe. So this is part of a bigger research project, and the question itself is quite complex, and the paper that I'm working on has a lot of graphs and empirical data. But in my presentation, I will try to focus on the overall narrative, and I will also try to come back to the question at the very end of neoliberalism, whether it's alive or how it's transforming in this particular region of Europe. So I'm sure you're familiar with the rise of illiberalism and various shades of populism in East Central Europe, and I think it's a good starting point to differentiate between what I see as four varieties of populism or illiberal populism in the region. The first I would call a strong illiberalism in Hungary under Viktor Orbán. The second is a weaker but increasingly also strong illiberalism in Poland under Kaczynski. The third variety is the Czech version, which I wouldn't call illiberal in a sense that I think illiberalism is a move towards less democratic, more authoritarian regime and socioeconomic structure, and we don't really see that happening in the Czech Republic. But it's more kind of a technocratic populism under Babiš. And finally, in Slovakia, we have a contained illiberalism, where we had a strong illiberal regime in the 90s under Mečiar, which created a consensus, more or less, among political elites for a long time to try to avoid that experience, which sort of contains a strong, or contained this strong illiberal counter movement that was taking place, that is taking place in Hungary. So these are the four outcomes in the region. And although these countries are often mentioned together, I think there are important differences in the political economic foundation of illiberalism, which is important to see, and reveals very much about the logic of how economy and class impact political outcomes. So what I'm doing in the paper is I'm using the theory of dependent development to explain the rise of different opportunity structures for illiberalism in the region. And why I like this approach is because I think it allows us to avoid two, well, we could say extremes, but two other approaches which I think both have limitations, but are very close to the theory of dependent development. So dependent development is a weaker formulation of dependency, but it still emphasizes the risks embedded in globalization and the kind of neoliberal integration into the global capitalist economy. Whereas harder versions of dependency theory, they characterize the region. You know, they were more pessimistic about the opportunities of dependency. Economic involution was a term coined by Burovoy. You know, the story about global capitalist companies extracting resources and making democratization basically impossible. Well, the difficulty with this approach is that you had a rise of a limited democracy in these countries, and it's hard to explain it from the perspective of strong dependency. And on the other hand, you had this dependency optimism, very much characterizing most of the Varieties of Capitalism scholarship, which argued that reindustrialization through foreign investment will allow the consolidation of democracy, which again, has been challenged by recent developments in the region. And I think a refocus on Cardozo and Toletto's dependency and development allows us to avoid these both the pessimism and the dependency optimism that characterize much of the comparative capitalism's literature. So what I'm showing in the paper is how the misgovernance of dependency creates two types of problems. One is economic disintegration, and the other is social disintegration. And to the degree that these four countries managed or didn't manage to govern dependency successfully, more or less successfully, it explains the intensity of economic and social disintegration. And what I try to do is to show the differences in the interaction between, on the one hand, neoliberal integration into global and European capitalist structures and domestic responses to governing dependency. So this first slide shows that there were very large differences in deindustrialization, which is one dimension of how we can measure economic disintegration in Eastern Europe. And as you can see, Hungary, although it's smaller than, for example, Poland, experienced a much more severe deindustrialization than basically any other countries in the region, which is related to the fact that Hungary didn't employ any sort of industrial policies, and Hungarian policymakers thought that welcoming European and global transnational corporations would modernize the economy and solve basically all problems. What this led to in the 90s was basically a complete wipeout of domestic productive capacities with long-term implications, both for the economy and for society. As I said, the tool that was thought that would solve this was foreign investment, and policymakers believed that this would reindustrialize the country, which happened to a certain extent. And as you can see, Hungary was really spearheading the competition for foreign investment, contrasted, for example, again, to the Polish case. But also, I would like to draw attention to the fact that it's declining after 2010 under Viktor Orbán. So this already shows you an important feature of illiberalism in Hungary. Finally, about economic disintegration, you can see that the lack of industrial policy in Hungary meant a huge polarization between domestic and foreign companies, where domestic companies aren't really able at all to gain advantage of global value chains. And again, you can contrast the Hungarian case to the Czech Republic and Poland, which had a more successful industrial and developmental policy regime and allowed a severe economic disintegration. And what this led to was a polarization of the business class in Hungary and the revolt of a large segment of the national bourgeoisie, which is a Hungarian characteristic rooted in economic disintegration. And in my paper, I argue, and also in my forthcoming book, I argue that this is a very important, though often neglected feature, the rise of this national bourgeoisie and its alliance with domestic nationalist politicians, and how they renegotiated the pact with transnational corporations in Hungary. And the other feature that we have to take into consideration is social disintegration. Here, Poland and Hungary look much more similar. The first is, though, the case of the complete collapse of jobs related to the industrialization and the agrarization in Hungary. Poland was more successful, but also Poland experienced spells of jobless growth, and its timing is telling for illiberal breakthrough. You can see this the destruction of jobs in the first part of 2000 ended in the election of the first illiberal populist government, and then later a sort of a jobless growth period preceded the second electoral success of Kaczynski's party. And in Hungary, you see this jobless growth period before Orbán's election. The other second feature is income inequality. which is again very bad in Poland. Again, timing important. Before the first election of the peace government, you see a rise in income inequality, and after the second term of the liberal populists in Poland, you see a decline in income inequality. Now, this is in contrast to the Hungarian case, where you didn't have a high inequality before Viktor Orbán took power, but you see a skyrocketing of income inequality now, leading to Hungary being the most unequal country in the Visegrad region. And I will come back to this, why this is the case. Let's just skip this for time. So what I argue in the paper is that you had a different, these countries had different approaches to managing social disintegration, and Hungary and Poland did much worse than, again, the Czech Republic. To a certain degree, Slovakia has experienced similar social disintegration in the 90s, which was an important factor behind the national populist support for Mečiar. The similarity in the Hungarian and Polish case is a significant emphasis on pacifying the victims of deindustrialization by pensions, so basically removing them from the labor market, whereas the Czech Republic employed a much more active intervention in the economy, trying to activate these people, and also employing a much more robust social policy regime to prevent a rise of income inequalities, which explains, I think, why you have a weaker social or working class revolt against the transition period in the Czech Republic. Also, the left had a different role in the Czech Republic compared to Hungary and Poland, where in both cases you had a neoliberal left implementing much of the neoliberal reforms. So the way I see the outcomes is you have this social and economic disintegration in Hungary. You have a polarized class structure and the working class revolting against post-socialist neoliberalism and also post-socialist neoliberal left. And you also have economic disintegration, which allows nationalist politicians basically to capitalize on the revolt of working classes and install a strong illiberalism in Hungary. You also have a very strong working class revolt against the post-socialist transformation in Poland, also driven by inequalities and working class dislocation. But the role of the business class is more ambiguous in Poland, because there's no illiberal party that could monopolize the support of domestic capitalists, whereas in Hungary, it's basically only the Fidesz that could monopolize the support of domestic capitalists.
1 minute.
That every other party was more or less supporting foreign investment only. And finally, to conclude, what we see, I think, in the region, especially the Hungarian case, shows us this quite well, is that we have a bifurcation of neoliberalism. So you have the decline of this cosmopolitan neoliberalism, which characterized much of the 90s and 2000s. And you have this national populist or statist neoliberalism. In the Hungarian case, it's even an authoritarian neoliberalism, which is on the rise. And as I mentioned, although transnational neoliberal elites might be happier with other representatives, political representatives, but they are quite happy to make a pact with national statists as well, as in the case of Hungary. The domestic elites clearly prefer, domestic economic elites clearly prefer the national statist Orbán in contrast to previous socialist liberals. So this leads to the rise of national populist neoliberalism, which basically hijacks the populist counter-movement of the working class and redistributes resources towards the economic elites to accelerate capital accumulation, which leads to huge tensions. And this explains the strength of illiberalism in Hungary, because to manage those tensions, you really need to be strongly authoritarian. In Poland, you have similar processes, but as I've mentioned, the relationship between the business class and the national populists is weaker, which explains why the Polish state is able to redistribute more resources towards the working class. And I think this is in relationship with this explains partially the fact why democratic backsliding hasn't advanced that far in Poland compared to Hungary. So this is the bird's eye view of my research on illiberalism in the Visegrad countries, and you can find much more empirical detail in the paper that is uploaded in the Dropbox, but also in my book that is forthcoming with Palgrave, which details the Hungarian case with comparative data on the region as well. So thank you very much for your attention.